Some powerful people in China think the country has a boy problem.
而中国人，你想这个男孩子都是这样女性化的、女兮兮的，哎呀，我真是发愁，没有阳刚之气。但是它确实是一个社会问题。
This was in May 2020. It's a man called Zhe Sifu, and he's a top delegate in China's most powerful advisory body. And that's basically like the US Senate. It's called the CPPCC.
This is my colleague Kerry Allen, who's an analyst at BBC Monitoring, focusing on China.
And he was saying that there's a really bad thing in Chinese society, which, as he sees it, is the girliness or feminization of boys. And he said that it was a problem that needed to be solved.
体育的锻炼，增加一些男性化、男老师。
Part of Kerry's job is to listen to Chinese officials, sometimes for hours.
You always hear quite a number of proposals, and some of them you don't give too much importance to. But about 6 months later, there was a notice from China's education ministry, and it seemed to approve his proposal.
That's when Kerry thought there might be more to it.
It said that there should be recruitment for retired athletes and people with sporting backgrounds, and he said that they should vigorously develop particular sports like football with a view to cultivating students' masculinity.
China's not the only country where those in power have sounded the alarm about how boys are raised and how men are expected to behave. In today's Global Jigsaw, we look at China's particular concerns about masculinity and why this matters, not only inside the country, especially for women, but also for the world. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw, an original podcast from BBC Monitoring, zooming in on political, security and social shifts around the world through the lens of its media. Our team listens to, watches and analyzes media narratives in 100 languages.
Radio Tehran.
Right, we must go now to Moscow.
Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
I mean, have you got any thoughts on that?
In this episode, as well as Kerry Allen, you'll hear Tom Lam, who's also from BBC Monitoring, and Suping Singh from the BBC's Chinese service. Tom is Chinese and analyses politics and the history of ideas in China for his work. He also noticed a spike in official concern about masculinity. At the same time, a pop phenomenon took off.
There has been an explosion of South Korean pop culture in recent years in China. And then K-pop are usually associated with boy bands, with kind of feminine outlook and makeup and extravagant outfit and styles. So this K-pop culture have been a concern of the Chinese government. There are also some discussion about like how Chinese young generation is going to influence by these kind of feminine boys.
The Chinese Communist Party has always had an interest in shaping the culture. Has anything changed under Xi Jinping?
We see even a strict control. For example, in 2019, the Broadcasting Authority banned some very popular palace drama series. One of the very famous one is called Story of Yanxi Palace. It portrayed power struggle, conspiracy, aristocratic lifestyle in an imperial palace, and they feel like it's not healthy, it's not promoting correct socialist core values. We have seen a lot of state media commentaries criticizing CC culture, saying that boys are too feminine and not strong and macho. They talk about CC culture and they don't have a good opinion of it because weak men can hardly put up a fight, against foreign enemies.
As a past student of Chinese language and culture, I'm curious about the language used to express ideas. The phrase that crops up in these commentaries is Liang Piao Wenhua. A direct translation is pretty culture, or as Tom translates it, sissy or effeminate culture. And the government did act on its concerns. Tom saw some swift moves, as well as discussion on the social media platform Sina Weibo.
For example, in September 2021, there's anti-CC campaign when the Broadcasting Authority issued an 8-point notice to kind of purge the pop industry, to put an end to abnormal aesthetics, quote unquote, such as CC culture. Many K-pop fan groups on Weibo were actually banned around the same time. The regional Hunan TV, which is very popular among young generation because they always invite young, pretty boys and girls, idols on the shows. The TV station actually had an internal notice to the participants to suggest them not to bite their lips, making silly faces and twist their hips. Another very popular show on Hunan TV, Happy Camp, was suddenly pulled out in 2021. After the notice, it was often criticized for promoting CC culture and unhealthy fan culture.
侦探，请就位。王宝强、刘昊然、张钧甯、程潇、马伯骞。
Let's go back to the language and the phrase the Communist Party uses to describe what we are calling masculinity.
They call it 阳刚之气 in Chinese. Yang, which means yang in the yin-yang concept. Yang could mean masculinity, but it could also mean the sun, strength, brightness, open, positive, active, as compared to yin, which could mean feminine, but also the moon, dark, shadow, hidden, even negative and sinister. And gan actually means strength or hard. The English word masculinity doesn't necessarily translate perfectly to the Chinese messages and the conversation we're describing.
Tom dug out some of the messages on Chinese social media discussing Yanggang Zhiqi. We've voiced them up. Here's a taste.
The cultivation of masculinity is to nourish the spirit of courage and fearlessness in students through a strong body. Both men and women can develop masculinity.
Why can't boys be sissy? Why can't they have a soft side? As an ordinary person, you can of course have your own way of being a human being. But as a public figure, have you considered the consequences?
Aside from those pretend sissies in the entertainment industry, aren't most boys in real life quite normal? To put it bluntly, it's alarmist talk.
Tell me more about where you found these comments.
Most of them came from Zhihu, which is a Q&A format forum similar to Quora. It's generally less censored than Weibo, and we can find some more in-depth discussion from time to time and some relatively more liberal views on this platform.
And there was also another revealing intervention by the powerful Broadcasting Authority.
In July 2022, the deputy director of the Broadcasting Authorities actually said that TV shows should not use or imitate foreign style.
Is that what's at the bottom of this? The fact that these are not native Chinese influences, but imported from abroad?
That's what they say. The state media actually blame Japanese and South Korean pop culture for feminizing Chinese male. And the state-run nationalist tabloid, Global Times, even claimed that it was a CIA conspiracy and was part of the US plot to weaken Japan after the war.
COVID-19 forced a reshuffle of priorities. But while state narratives focused on the pandemic response, discussions on social media about men and women continued. And that was partly because, as we've seen in other countries, some attempts to contain COVID had a knock-on effect for women. That's a subject close to Kerry's heart.
There has been a rise in domestic violence, for example, so there's been talk about whether men need to change. There have also been discussions about the role of women in the family unit. Do women stay home and look after the family? What does it mean to be a man and a woman? At the same time as the state has been trying to encourage men to be more masculine, women are being pushed into more traditional roles. Also, there have been proposals very much geared towards trying to get women to have more children.
A lot has been said in recent years about China's demographic crisis and its need for a bigger workforce. That is why China abandoned its long-standing one-child policy. At the same time, the rhetoric around women and equality used by Xi Jinping continues to be, on the face of it, pretty impressive.
让性别平等落到实处。
The protection of women's rights and interests must become a commitment at the national level. As we pursue post-COVID recovery, we need to create new opportunities for women to participate in decision-making and in national, economic, cultural, and social governance. We need to eliminate prejudice, discrimination, and violence against women and make gender equality a social norm and moral imperative observed by all.
遵循的行为规范和价值标准。
Xi said this at the United Nations in 2020. But here comes the reality check.
During the National Congress, when Xi Jinping was elected for a historic third term, he more or less removed women from key roles. So he used to, in the Politburo, have one woman. And Sun Chunlan, she retired. And now there isn't a single woman in Xi Jinping's inner circle.
And what have you observed about how women feel about their place in society today?
Well, largely women feel that they are only in subservient roles. They're not able to rise through the ranks. They often talk about how they feel there's job discrimination if they've not had a baby. Women feel they have to lie on job certificates and say that they have a family in order to be appointed. So once women are married, for example, in January 2021, there was the introduction of a cool-off period if they want to get divorced. And that sparked concerns among women about increases of domestic violence, human trafficking, violence against women. The state wants to keep couples married and get couples married. It's just that many women have said within those units they could potentially be more at risk. There are also concerns among women that the state reinforces the subservient role of women, not only via state media and news articles, but also in entertainment media.
血氧饱和度87，连90%都控制不住了。该想的办法都想过了，试过俯卧也没有，那得有足够的人手啊。
So early in the pandemic, there was huge criticism of what was meant to be China's first drama in a COVID-19 era. And a lot of women during that time were on the front line. They were doctors, they were nurses, and they played a key role. But within this drama, called Heroes in Harm's Way, women took offence with what they saw as women only really being in supportive roles, looking up to male doctors, not really leading the show.
The story of Chinese feminism and its struggle goes back a long way. Here, with some more context, is Su Pingxing of the BBC's Chinese service.
Mao Zedong famously said, "Women hold up half the sky, 妇女能顶半边天." And many women's rights were enshrined in the first constitution of the People's Republic in 1954. In the late 1980s, reforms allowed women to participate more in politics. Record numbers of women went to university, and feminism became more visible. In 2001, China amended its marriage law to make physical abuse grounds for divorce. But in 2011, the Supreme Court ruled that property should go to the owner listed in the deeds, usually the man, rather than be split equally on divorce. After years of sex-selective abortions driven by the one-child policy, China now has 30 million more men than women. This imbalance has been blamed for a surge in the trafficking of women as brides for rural men, from both outside and inside China. Under Xi Jinping, feminist activism and the state pushback against it have both increased. In 2015, activists who became known as the Feminist Five were arrested for planning to hand out stickers about sexual harassment on public transport. The Me Too movement arrived in 2018 when Luo Xixi accused her former professor of sexual harassment. And in 2021, tennis star Peng Shuai disappeared for a while after accusing a former vice premier of sexual assault.
As Kerry mentioned, there were reports that violence against women in the home and outside increased during the zero-COVID lockdowns. The government hasn't released any official statistics on that, but some cases attracted international attention.
In a city called Tangshan, a group of women were in a restaurant and a man started to try and touch one of the women and she wasn't happy. And he got very aggressive very quickly, eventually kicking her in the head.
And how do we know about the Tangshan attack?
CCTV footage was posted anonymously and it quickly went viral on platforms like Sina Weibo. There were thousands, tens of thousands of shares, huge angry response online, hundreds of thousands of social media users commenting, and they very much took criticism again with the state's narrative on what this was.
How did state media report this?
State media long-term have struggled to talk about gender-motivated attacks. With the Tangshan attacks, they just said it was an assault, and later on after the attack, they tried to blame it on gang violence. It still very much feels that male violence on women is not being properly addressed in Chinese media. And women have been en masse online saying, men's behaviour has to change. Never any mention of this in state media.
It's estimated that around 1 billion people in China have access to the internet. That's over 70% of the population. So the information space we are talking about is huge, and the state is always watching.
At the time when I was looking at the Tangshan attacks, there were hashtags quickly going viral on Sina Weibo. These hashtags became muted. Suddenly you couldn't click the links, you couldn't see the scale of anger. And some media will take it upon themselves on these platforms to mute replies because if they see there's a big enough discussion taking place, which could be perceived as being critical of the state, they don't want to be implicated in that.
Last year, a war of words erupted on Weibo. We're talking 1 billion views and more than 900,000 responses. Kerry watched it unfold.
That was very big. So the Communist Youth League put out a number of pictures of party members making huge achievements throughout the century. And none of these pictures showed women. This one newspaper, South China Morning Post, which is blocked in mainland China, captured some of the Weibo comments at the time. And examples were, how do you avoid using pictures of women heroes who made contributions to the country? There was this phrase, 直男癌, which a lot of female social media users started using. In English, it means straight man cancer. And they were saying that it was men being sexist, chauvinistic in their reporting. And this was a problem that kept on appearing in Chinese media. The Communist League responded and said that feminism was a cancer.
So what are the prospects for women and feminism in today's China? There's always a surge of comments on social media around the time of the 2 big government meetings every March, known as the 2 sessions.
This year, we saw President Xi Jinping cement his new cabinet for the next 5 years, and it was very evident that this year it's made up entirely of men. And at the other session, where delegates put forward proposals for policy changes, it was very telling that there was a continued focus on really encouraging women to have more children. Proposals, for example, to offer dating and marriage platforms online, also policies on broadening maternity leave benefits, releasing women from financial responsibilities if they use assisted reproductive technologies, and many benefits framed around getting mothers of 1 or 2 children to have more. And yet, on social media platforms, I keep seeing this same message. What if we don't want to have children? What if we don't want to be reduced to baby-making machines?
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. To understand what could be driving Beijing's shifting attitudes to masculinity and feminism, here's Tom with a look back at history.
We can see that from the historical narrative in Chinese education and also in the media, especially after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. They have been promoting patriotic education, that China has suffered what is called a century of humiliation, starting from the First Opium War with Britain in 1839. The humiliation narrative argues that China needs to be strong to defend itself from foreign adversaries, and especially in Xi Jinping's rule, the narrative was lifted to a new level to achieve a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and also build a rich and powerful modern China.
Before Beijing upped the ante, China's foreign messaging went through decades of evolution.
Actually, anti-Western diplomatic rhetoric has had a long history in communist China during the Mao Zedong era, when China was very close to the Soviet Union and involved in Korean War, fighting against the US. However, after the Cultural Revolution and after Mao era, Deng Xiaoping adopted a relatively Western-friendly approach, which was described as hide your strength and buy your time. And in Jiang Zemin era, which was in the 90s, it was described as keep quiet, we'll help you make big fortune. And in Hu Jintao era, it was described as China's peaceful rise, as China was getting more powerful economically.
And we've now reached the era of wolf warrior diplomacy. Much has been said in Western media about Beijing adopting a far more confrontational and combative approach in recent years. The name Wolf Warrior comes from two very popular movies about the adventures of a Chinese special forces soldier fighting enemies abroad. The concept does sound quite stereotypically male. Can you see any connection at all between the wolf warrior diplomats and this more recent masculinity debate?
Well, we see a lot of criticism of the so-called sissy culture come from a very nationalist point of view, that the nation could be in danger if men become what they call too feminine. And patriotism and nationalism are obvious also what motivates wolf warriors and these who praise them. So yes, I think they appear to have overlapping attitude, even though they might not be explicit or spelled out.
Could it simply be that the so-called wolf warrior approach is tied to Beijing's growing economic and geopolitical clout?
I think China wants to have its own version of events represented in the global information space, apart from the Western-oriented or Western-dominated narrative and set of values. China is getting more powerful. They're looking for a more equal footing with the US. So it's natural for them to become more assertive, defending from the criticism on, for example, human rights issues, and also become more aggressive on the global information battlefield.
And is this wolf warrior approach here to stay? Tom says it's complicated.
Interestingly, an outspoken wolf warrior, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, was quietly removed from his post a few months ago. Some saw that as a sign that China might be dialing back its wolf warrior approach. It does appear to me that China is not presenting quite as aggressively at the moment. Partly, I think, because it was relatively isolated during the pandemic, both economically and diplomatically. We can see Beijing has been active diplomatically in securing a deal between the bitter rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and in offering to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. It also continues to position itself as the alternative to the US as a global leader. But as the new Foreign Minister Qin Gang has indicated, China is not about to show what it calls weakness when it comes to what it regards as its core interests, such as Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. And that's still deeply rooted in what feels like quite a macho mentality of acting tough and hitting back when facing foreign adversaries.
Beijing's assertiveness on what Tom calls the global information battlefield clearly has many motivations and nuances, and will remain one of BBC Monitoring's key focuses for the foreseeable future. But does China's new focus on masculinity tell us anything about how we can expect Beijing to behave at home and internationally?
Domestically, we have seen that there are a lot of concern over this promotion of a certain kind of masculinity could lead to more school bullying and more suppression of women, sexual and gender minorities, and simply just boys who are seen as just not men enough, It may also be harder to come out as gay or trans in China. The long-term impact and subtle impact on Chinese society could be very significant. In terms of macho wolf warrior diplomacy, the longer that goes on, the more negatively China will be viewed by the world. As someone who monitors Chinese media, I can say that we can already see that happening.
Thanks to Carrie Allen, Tom Lam, and Su-Ping Singh. The producers are Lucy Bailey and Krista Shaturi. The sound engineer is John Boland and our editor is Judy King. And we'd love to hear from you. If there's a story you'd like to hear in future episodes, you can get in touch. Our email address is theglobaljigsaw, all one word, @bbc.co.uk. That's it for now. If you can, subscribe or follow The Global Jigsaw so you never miss an edition. I'm Krassi Twig. Thanks for listening and do join us again next time.